Oi, oi, it's your boy, the Misha Serkinov of pissing anti-boxing MMA fans of. Jack Slack is the Jack Slack podcast, and we're coming at you on Wednesday, because no boycast this week. It's a slow week. If you are a Patreon boy, I put up my first ADCC study this week on the big boys in the big roidy division. I mean, everyone's roidy at ADCC, but yeah, got some interesting stuff in that. Supine shin-to-shin stuff, body lock passing, the biggest delts you've ever seen on professional athletes. But it was good fun, and I've been working on trying to assemble my just trying to assemble my the things I picked up watching ADCC this year, the trends and so on, for a while. I think it's been 4 weeks now since the event, but I've got a couple of others, or I'm going to have a couple of others coming as I organise my thoughts. But I thought I'd start with the big roidy boys, because that sets up the inevitable Gordon Ryan article next time. If you haven't read that, go read it. If you don't know anything about grappling, you'll still have a good time looking at the pictures. It's all narrated by yours truly. And yeah, it's like a mini podcast in itself. If you just can't get enough nerdy, in the weeds, technical shit, that's for you. Anyway, this week we've got a fight that I don't imagine, or a fight night that I don't imagine is going to garner a lot of out of the ordinary interest. I imagine it'll get the same views as like a Strickland versus Hall or whatever, you know. We've reached the point where the UFC gets the number of viewers it does, unless it does something special. But it has like a fairly decent-sized floor that it won't fall through. But honestly, looking at these fights this weekend, I was getting into a funk, because there's been a couple of shows like this where I've been going, well, you know, people aren't going to want to hear me talk about that. And I've now worked out that the way to get myself out of the funk is just to watch the fights of the people who are on the card, which is the last thing I want to do when I look at some of these cards. But it gets me back in a good mood, and it gives me some stuff to talk about. So I actually committed to reminding myself who these people are. And honestly, I thought this card was okay before, and I still think it's okay now. I don't think it's terrible. One of the things that I think is turning people off is using Alexa Grasso versus Viviane Araujo as the main event, when you would assume the main event is the most significant and probably best fight on the card, or one of the best fights on the card. And that isn't the case a lot of the time, but it's especially not the case with this one. I think people just assume that this main event's supposed to be where it peaks, and I think a lot of the stuff on this card is better than that. With that being said, I watched Alexa Grasso and Viviane Araujo's last few fights, and I had a fair bit of fun. I think they're quite interesting. I think they match up quite interestingly against each other. Don't have a lot to say, so we'll do that now. Alexa Grasso, I said it in the week, I said if she could knock out anyone, she'd be so marketable. Because one, she's got the Mexican demographic inbuilt. Two, she's got good boxing, it's just that she isn't finishing anyone. And three, she's cute. And when I tweeted that, I didn't spell that out on Twitter, but people seemed shocked that I thought she'd be marketable if she finished some people. I don't know, I seem to be finding the densest sector of Twitter at the moment. I've somehow extended beyond the friends of friends groups, and now I'm just drawing in utter cretins. But yeah, you can see why Alexa Grasso would be popular, because people like people who stand and bang, people like people who are good boxers. And this has always been the case, the UFC desperately wants some Mexican stars, because they are the single largest combat sports enjoying demographic in the world. It just so happens that combat sport is boxing, but there is enough familiarity that you should be able to bring it over. Think of how hard they were pushing Cain Velasquez as Mexican, and I don't think he'd ever been to Mexico before he turned up there and gassed out against Verdum. Meanwhile, Viviane Araujo is a big muscular Brazilian. I mean, part of the reason why this is a main event, they're probably the two highest ranked fighters in their divisions. Oh, actually, no, you got Askarov versus Royle, which is going to be contender for best fight. But they're both fairly attractive, and that also helps. Whether you like it or not, it does. Though Jonathan Martinez is pretty attractive himself, so we'll get on to him in a minute. But Araujo is interesting because people like her striking. I've seen a few people say, oh yeah, she's one of the more interesting strikers in this god-awful women's flyweight division. But what I got from watching her fight with Andrea Lee, especially, was she makes moves like you think someone who like someone who knows how to strike should, but she also makes massive errors all the time. The key one, I mean, she's like, so she'll shoulder fake and then fade away. She'll do a little slide back. And that one move, we talked about it with Nate Landwehr, that one move can diffuse basically, you could be levels below the guy. If he's relying on good counter striking, you fake and you move back, and then you come in again when he swings or doesn't swing. You're giving him fits. Go watch that Landwehr Onama fight for that. The one that James Krause lost $3 million on, allegedly. I've had so many questions about that and James Krause's gambling racket, and I've never got round to it, but that whole thing's so sketchy. I feel like as a coach, you probably shouldn't be betting on fights, even if it's your own fighters to win. There was a really who was it? Oh, Uriah Faber, Master Tong or whoever it was. Is it Master Tong or Master Toddy? Their Muay Thai coach basically I think he bet on Barao against Faber. It was crazy, and he bet like $1 million on it, and then had to flee. But anyway, yeah, Araujo, she does that. She fakes and goes back. She switches stances from time to time, but then when she comes in, her head's always on a fucking line. Never moves her head side to side unless she's got the Rashad Evans thing, which is when she's on the outside, not close enough to strike, she's moving her head side to side. And then as soon as she steps close enough to be hit, she's thinking about being hit and her head stops moving. But then she'll come in with a jab or whatever, normally a jab, and she'll drop her other hand to her chest. And so she got chinned with a left hook by Lee in the first round of that fight. You watch her against people like Katlyn Chookagian, who, boring as hell, but will hit people. She will hit a bitch. She's been known to. So yeah, it's kind of this weird thing where she does the things, some things that you look at and you go, oh, she must know what she's doing. And then you watch her get hit all the time and you go, oh, maybe she doesn't. But there's moments, like in the first round of that Lee fight, and I think in the third round too, she jabs, fades back as Lee swings at her, and then she comes in and she leaps in and digs the body with a big left hook. And you went, mwah, perfect. More of that, Vivian Araujo. She also sets up her takedowns pretty well because, a lot of her game is coming in and getting punched in the face on the counter. If she comes in as if to punch and then drops levels, she gets under her opponent's elbows and gets onto their hips. And her takedowns are good. I'm thinking of the Lee fight because that's the last one I watched, but she hoisted her into the air like she was nothing and threw her around. And Lee's pretty good in the clinch. Say what you want about Andrea Lee and her affection for racists, but she's a good clinch fighter. So that was interesting. But this is the thing, I think the reason these two match up so well is Alexa Grasso, really fun boxing, but basically, if people try and take her down, they normally can. She did it okay in areas against, I think it was Esparza, but she's one of those ones who, there's staying on your feet for a long time in a clinch or whatever, but it's not really, it's a moral victory, but it's not really what you need to be doing. It's that constant thing we're talking about. If you aren't breaking away, you haven't effectively defended the takedown because you're losing time now. There's always a ticking clock on the striker every time they hit the clinch. But Alexa Grasso's last one was Joanne Wood, and I think that was the first fight in something like 5-6 years that she finished. And it was really, it was Joanne Wood doing the worst part of what Joanne Wood does. She's walking up to her, throwing very slow, soft kicks, coming in on one leg, swinging punches, and then she's grabbing and throwing a knee. The first takedown in that fight looks like Grasso times it well, but really what happens is Joanne Wood grabs a double collar tie, throws a knee, misses, and falls to her back. That was the big Joanne Calderwood / Joanne Wood flaw. Aside from not really hitting with a lot of pop, she fought in a way that had her on one leg a lot of the time, and she couldn't get back up off her back. Even when people thought she was making big changes and getting better, it was just throwing up triangles from her back. And then the second takedown in that fight was basically, I think Wood tried to clinch and initiate the takedown, but there was momentum, and she threw herself past Grasso, and then Grasso was on her back. And then the fighting for the rear naked choke wasn't, there wasn't a lot of hand fighting involved. It kind of seemed like she just sort of gave up. But Wood, she came into the UFC with promise, and then she just sort of declined with occasional surprise victories like that triangle over, who was it? Fuck, I can't remember. But Alexa Grasso got a finish over someone who was basically 1 foot out the door at that point. So the intrigue in this is that Araujo will be there to be hit, and Grasso's combinations are really nice. And this is the thing, like, she will do a good job of throwing some punches and then sliding out the side door, which is a huge part of staying out of clinches and staying off the floor and staying out of trouble as a striker in MMA. You know, people were, I'll always go back to talking about Ronda Rousey when I wrote Killing the Queen, Ronda Rousey. And I was like, footwork is the most important part. And people were like, no, she'll just catch up with you. And then, wouldn't you fucking know it? Footwork was the most important part. But your footwork will fail at some point. You will probably get cornered. If the person isn't fighting like an absolute nutter, as Ronda was, even then, you could still end up in a clinch. I mean, Holly Holm ended up in a clinch like 3 times in that fight. It's so hard to avoid the clinch. This is the thing that the Gracie challenge was built on. Doesn't matter provided you don't get knocked out in one punch, at some point you will fall into the clinch. So Grasso has always been, or has especially recently, been very good at popping off 2 or 3 punches, maybe a kick, sliding out the side door, but she still will get caught in clinches and taken down, and or controlled, which is the difficult part. So the fun part of this fight is that Araujo is probably going to get punched in the face a fair amount, but in service of dropping on the hips, picking up a big takedown, or moving her to the fence and picking up a big takedown. And she's a decent hitter in her own right for a women's flyweight. So she'll be throwing the entire time when she's not ducking on hips. So yeah, this is a real test of Araujo, or rather, this is a real test of Grasso, how she can deal with the effective threat of striking and a level change, which very few, there's an awful lot of specialists in women's flyweight. So that's about it. I mean, it's a fairly intriguing fight. It'd be nice to see Grasso put it together at last. I mean, this would be a 4th in a row for her, I think, victory-wise. And she's got a decision loss to the current champ. Oh, no, sorry, this is flyweight now. So she's got a decision loss to the former strawweight champ. She's 3-0 at flyweight. She made Macy Barber look very bad, which was, Macy Barber will make herself look bad a lot of the time, but it was certainly a good performance from Grasso. So she's in a good spot, whereas Vivian Araujo, she's only got 1 win in her current streak. I mean, she beat Andrea Lee, which was good, but very recent loss to Katlyn Chookagian looming, which will always limit your ability, your hype at flyweight, because Katlyn Chookagian just keeps beating people at flyweight, even though she fights in the most boring way. Everyone hates it. They keep putting it on main cards. You're like, why the fuck are you doing that? They keep signing her back when her contract expires. She's never, she's won something like 12 decisions in the UFC now, in 13 fights, I think it is. But, this is the thing. Like, if Araujo wins this one and she only has 2 on the trot, she could still end up fighting Valentina Shevchenko, because that's what they do. They just throw in whoever's around. Even though we all want to see the rematch with Talia Santos, or Tyler, whatever her name is. So there you go. I got a good couple of minutes out of that fight. What's good on this card that I'm looking forward to? Co-main events, Jonathan Martinez versus Cub Swanson. Tricky one, because, Cub Swanson, this is one of those ones that's quite clever, because Cub Swanson's problems in recent years have been sort of the increasing fragility of aging. It doesn't matter who you are. I mean, some very rare exceptions, guys getting into like their late 30s, early 40s, and still having iron chins. George Foreman being a great example. But typically, the older you get, the more your body breaks down on you. And that means more injuries, longer times between fights, more getting hurt in fights, and then obviously more stoppages as a result. Now, he lost a couple of decisions, Frankie Edgar, Shane Burgos. The Burgos one was a split decision. I can't recall who I thought won that one. Had the comeback against Crone Gracie, where he looked like a guy who'd been fighting at the top levels for years against a guy who hadn't, and afterwards decided that he didn't want to. But then he had his knee blown out in a grappling match against Jake Shields. That was just a reap. That wasn't even a leg attack. I mean, it was, it's a leg attack in that it was putting pressure on the joint, but he wasn't in a heel hook. He was just in a reap, and he squirmed around the wrong way and blew out his ACL. Had to take the best part of a year off. Actually, a full year off. Dude, he came back a year to the day. That's fantastic. Beat Daniel Pineda pretty surprisingly by knockout. That was one where he looked like he was going to have a rough time of it in the first round. And then as the fight progressed, Pineda looked fucking huge for a start. but it just became obvious it wasn't going to be able to hang around. And then Giga Chikadze beat him by body kick in the first round. And then he had a fight with Darren Elkins, December 2021. I thought he looked fantastic. I mean, Darren Elkins is a pretty safe fight if you've got power and a scrambly grappling game. Because if there's one thing that Darren Elkins can't do, it's hurt you until you're tired. Darren Elkins is in a weird spot, man, because he like his whole game is taking people down. He's not amazing at that. Taking a ton of damage and hoping that he tires you out. But he's only fighting 3-rounders. So unless you really are going hell for leather trying to stop him, you might not even get tired. So it's a weird place to be. But in this fight, Cub Swanson fights Jonathan Martinez, who, like Darren Elkins, does not pose much of a threat of knocking you out. Now, that's not quite the same, because Darren Elkins is a pretty famous non-hitter. You know, he's not a great... When he connects with people, it doesn't tend to hurt them unless they're already knackered. Jonathan Martinez has a thing on the other end where I have seen him hurt people. I've seen him stun them with punches and good body kicks and things. And then he sits back, you know. I mean, I've never seen him, like, have a guy doubled over, ready to just, you know, the stoppage there for the taking, and him not go for it. But you see him land good blows, and you go, oh, yeah, now, go, push it. And he just won't. I think I said it last week. I say it all the time, but he's the fighter's fighter, but he kind of isn't. He's the fighter for someone who, if you wanted to watch someone and learn the right way to do things in fights and just be technically good, Jonathan Martinez is a great watch, because very clean, very crisp, very technical, striking, takedown defense, the odd takedown of his own. But if you wanted to make a fortune from fighting like Jonathan Martinez is not going to get you outside of like 15-15. I don't think he's ever going to fight for more than that. He's very, very good, but not ever going to gain a fan following unless, and this is the interesting part about this fight, he starts stopping people. Now, Giga Chikadze, I believe Cub Swanson was his first stoppage in the UFC, because Giga Chikadze came in having fought, you know, I think it was Explode Fighting Championship or something like that. It was one of those ones where they either find people who are going to lose for money, or they find people who are completely delusional. So he armbarred some guy whose record is like 4-40 at some point. And the whole plan was like, he's a glory fighter, we'll get him into the UFC. They were like, we don't want him. So they went, fuck, we'll get some fights. They put him in against absolute scrubs. He scored some finishes. He fought on the Contender Series. He arrived in the UFC. And then in the UFC, he stopped nobody until he met old man Cub Swanson. But he'd been fighting like younger but unknown guys before that. He fought a guy who was like 4 feet tall. The guy who attempted to murder his own sister. I can't remember his name. But then he started fighting these older guys, and he fought Edson Barboza and stopped him. So it can happen. Like, the names in a lot of these divisions, especially featherweight, are getting older. So they could be more ripe for knocking off, or at least stopping, than some of these younger guys who are lower down the rankings. I think that Jonathan Martinez does have it within him to stop Cub Swanson. I think he also has it within him to classily outpoint Cub Swanson to no real excitement. And I think Cub Swanson has it in him to stop Jonathan Martinez. I mean, he's still a great hitter. He's very tricky. You know, a lot of the stuff he does isn't necessarily, I don't want to say smart, but very wide looping shots a lot of the time. Things like leaping left hook into step up left body kick, you know, stuff like that, really weird combinations. But that makes him tricky. That makes him hard to read. And, you know, he's always got the overhand or the right straight that he can knock you out with. It's just how much can he put the chaos on Martinez, whose game is largely staying off, you know, going, oh, well, I'll slot a nice body kick in there or something like that, or a low kick, and then I'll slide away and chill for another 10 seconds, and always coming in again, okay, well, I'll circle off to my right, and then maybe I'll come back in. You know, very aloof fighting style is what I'd call it. So I think that's a fun fucking fight. Cub Swanson's last one against Darren Elkins was an absolute joy to watch, even though it was against sort of like a punch bag that won't hit back. He was doing things like he'd hit a dart, and then he switched to southpaw, hit a dart with his left straight, sliding down Elkins' right side, stopped halfway, because Elkins took the punch and was pivoting to try and face him. So Swanson stopped halfway, and Elkins threw the punch ahead of him where he thought he was going. It was really slick. Moonwalked back out of the dart. Other good stuff. Askarov versus Brandon Royle. Obviously a banger. Askarov's got the same sort of thing as that Giga Chikadze thing. He came in with so much hype. He'd been, was it ACA, ACB, wherever he was, somewhere in Russia. People were going, he's got a twister win, he's got equal number of knockouts and submissions or some shit like that. He's finished everyone he's met in his last 8. And then he came to the UFC, he's never finished anyone and never even come close. I mean, it just shows that this flyweight division has gotten really good. But he's coming off the loss to Brandon Royle, who really, Askarov, even in his draw against, was it Brandon Moreno? Even then, never looked like in a lot of trouble. Against Kai Kara-France, Kara-France was doing such a great job defending takedowns and hitting him and hurting him that Askarov looked really quite lost and confused at a lot of points in that fight. Did I say Kai Kara-France? Yeah, I meant Kai Kara-France. Meanwhile, Brandon Royle is on the rebound, actually. He's won 2 back-to-back now. One was against Bontorin, which was one that some people disagreed with the decision. It was a split decision. But most recently, guillotine Matt Schnell. Mr. Pay the Fighters Less, Matt Schnell. It was a fun fight. Matt Schnell's fights are always fun. But that was back in May. It's good because he lost to Moreno and Pantoja back-to-back. He lost the Moreno one, which was a really good, fun, scrambly fight. But based on that shoulder injury, posted up on his hand in a scramble, and his shoulder just popped out. And Brandon Gibson wasn't around to violently jerk it back into place. But after that Pantoja loss, I felt like, I hope he doesn't get a third one here, because they'll bounce him. They would bounce you. If you're a flyweight and you lose 3 in a row, they're bouncing you. You're gone. And where are you going? I don't know what Bellator's flyweight division even is like, if they have one. But the Bontorin win, I was happy to see him win it just because it kept him around, but the Schnell fight was quite impressive. Always a wild man, always going to run in and get hurt. The thing is that I can't see Askarov stunning him, because a lot of what Royle does, it reminds me a little bit of Andy Risti. There's a lot of stepping knees and hooks into stepping knees and then throwing hands as you come down from your stepping knees, which is a really fun sort of marching, seek and destroy style of fighting. But it does mean that you also step onto right hands quite a lot and get dropped, which has happened to Royle quite a lot. Happened against Kai Kara-France like 4 times. So they were knocking 7 bells out of each other, him and Kai Kara-France. But Askarov's not going to be like the guy. To my mind, he's not the kind of guy who's going to pop a straight right down the pipe and knock you out while you're stepping up into a wild exchange trying to knee him. If you're throwing lots of knees against Askarov, I'm expecting him to bundle you over onto the mat and wrestle you. Now, Royval's weaknesses in the past, Pantoja got on his back and choked him out, but that, Pantoja is one of those 3 guys in that division who are just great at shooting straight to the back. But finished him with a rear naked choke. Brandon Moreno, I thought he was going even with one of the best grapplers in the division on the mat. Tim Elliott is a great example, because that's the fight he came into the UFC on. He was known as a striker. He came into the UFC basically in a grappling match against a very savvy grappler and choked him in the second round. But Tim Elliott's kind of a wild man, and Askarov's not sort of jumping all over the place, diving on guillotines and things like that. He's not a smothering traditional Dagestani sort of top player, but I don't think he's going to make the same sort of mistakes. I don't think his grappling game is as scramble friendly as certainly Moreno's is. But really good fight. High chance of it being a banger. Can't wait. Possible pick for fight of the night. The other one that I really like on this card is Assunção versus Henry. Rafael Assunção, very much in the decline of his career now, but then so is Cub Swanson. You can recapture some magic and be physically declining. Had a really rough one against, he's on a 4-fight losing streak. Marlon Moraes knocked him down and guillotined him. Sandhagen decisioned him. Cody Garbrandt knocked him out in the only Cody Garbrandt win in God knows how long. And then Ricky Simone did the job on him by setting up the threat of the takedown, then faking the takedown on the fence and coming up with the right hand. It was fantastic. But Victor Henry, this is a weird one because it's a name for Victor Henry, but this seems like a step back because Victor Henry came in, he was booked short notice against Rani Barcelos, and then that fight got cancelled due to COVID, and then they rebooked it anyway because he'd accepted the fight, and they said, fuck it, you're coming up to the UFC, you might as well. And Victor Henry he reminds me why I love this sport so much, because while we do have most of the names under one roof, and that means you get a lot of good fights all the time, there are still guys out in the middle of nowhere you've not heard of, I've not heard of, who come in and are killers. And you're like, fucking hell, I had no idea. Half of it is you then convince yourself you've got to start watching regional MMA and whatnot, and you're always really disappointed. But Victor Henry had been fighting like Masahiro Kanehara, who's been washed for years and wasn't that good to begin with, in Rising. Turned up against Randy Barcelos, who is probably the best unranked fighter going, or one of, in that bantamweight division. So hot right now. And I mean, you saw Randy Barcelos the other day kicking the shit out of that poor lad. But Victor Henry came in, took some hard knocks from Randy Barcelos in the early going, and then just overwhelmed him. It was really quite impressive. Actually, the strike stats I saw in the third round, I mean, they might have been bollocks because they were on the live broadcast. But they seemed surprisingly not as lopsided as I thought they were. But I mean, the general impression you got watching that fight was that Victor Henry was overwhelming Randy Barcelos, doing great work. He had Josh Barnett in his corner, and they showed him between, I think it was round 1 and round 2, and he said, freeze him with feints, freeze him with your, and then he did this shoulder fake, and then they cut the camera to the other corner. But it was really funny because they cut the mic just as he was doing the shoulder fake, saying, do your, and he really did. Like, if you watch the first round even, he's backing Barcelos up a lot of the time. He's doing like lots of step-up kicks. And the very first one he does, he throws a step-up left kick to the body. And Barcelos parries it across, like Jorge Masvidal against Donald Cerrone or countless other examples we've given, and comes with a right uppercut and cracks his head back. And he went, fucking hell. Ooh, don't be throwing out slow, lazy kicks against Randy Barcelos. And then he did it 100 more times, and Barcelos didn't counter any of them. Like, that's the difference. If you give a guy one chance to counter, he'll get it. If you give him like 100 chances to counter, you just keep going, he's going to stop countering. And that's how overwhelming people works. It's and there was a beautiful one in round 1, and he did it throughout the fight, where he'd fake with his left shoulder as if to step in and jab, and then just walk up into a slower right hand. It was really a gorgeous, both feinting and rhythm manipulation, which are two of the pillars of beating a good counterpuncher. You've got a dangerous counterpuncher, feint lots, throw lots of real shit too, because you've got to get the feints working, but feint lots and change up the rhythm of your punch, or not the rhythm, the tempo of your punching. You don't have to throw everything at 100%. In fact, last weekend, Alistair Overeem against Badr Hari, having a nightmare with the jab and the right straight in the first round, doing these big lunging, stepping punches, the cheap punch, step in with your... It's a shift. He goes onto his left foot, squares up, and then steps in with a left uppercut or a left up jab or a left straight or whatever, while stepping with his right leg. And he was awful for the first 2 rounds. And in the third round, he comes out lumbering and suddenly just switches up the tempo. The left straight is the fastest I've ever seen from him. And he does it like 3 or 4 times. He goes like lumbering sort of right straight into running left straight. And he catches Badr and knocks him down twice. Also debuted an uppercut that he'd never had a good uppercut before. He had success with it in the first round from a clinch, because the clinch is always a grey area in kickboxing, when they just started ignoring holding and hitting because they wanted Krokop to get some wins. But yeah, he found that and started working that too. A lead hand uppercut off a rear hand collar tie, which I really like. You'll see Islam Makhachev doing that, and Matt Linden back in the day. Also Sandy Sadler in boxing. Anyway, fucking getting distracted. But yeah, tempo changes, really important for good striking. There were a lot of really gorgeous moments in that fight. And the thing about working at 100 miles an hour, or rather a 100 strike around pace, as Henry was that I can't go through and break down every cool exchange. It's with Badr Hari versus Alistair Overeem, I could probably break that fight down to about 5 or 6 important exchanges. This one was just constant, and Barcelos wasn't like a rag in the wind. He'd grit down on his mouthpiece and he'd throw a 4-piece combo back, smash Henry in the head, and Henry would roll with the punches or just take him and be like, okay, and keep working. But there was a really nice one where Barcelos, he'd try and break the pressure with takedowns, which is a great idea. If you can get the guy off his feet, 1, you stop the pressure for that moment until he gets up. 2, he's going to think twice about just walking in on you again. But Henry turned his back into a standing rear body lock along the cage, as we're always talking about. And then your options typically are swing your arm over for an overhook, which is the least good of those options, flattening yourself along the fence in the process. The good ones are like separate their hands and turn back into them. Or you can start poking your elbow back through the lock. So they've got their arms locked around you. You just start digging your elbow back behind you, and then you drop it down and swing it up into an underhook as you turn into them. And he did something different, which I don't think I've seen much before. he was fighting them. He was pushing down on the wrists, trying to break them apart. Sorry, break the hands apart. And then he inserted his right hand inside of Barcelos' left wrist, and then swung his arm wide, his left hand over his head for a whizzer, and he pummeled he had the underhook already as he turned back into him with that hand inside the wrist. It was really nice, and you don't see it a lot. Or at least I haven't seen it a lot. You know, you might see it if you're a good wrestler, and you're like, yeah, all the time. But, it's normally those dig the elbow in and get the underhook, or separate the hands and turn back into them. That little cross pummel and throw the arm over the head. That's a new one for me, at least. So no disrespect to Rafael Assunção, who I was calling for a title shot for years ago, because he is like the most avoided fighter on the... Well, he wasn't avoided. He was just like, nobody wanted to fight him, because if you lost to him, it would be boring on an undercard, and no one would see it. And if you beat him, you're taking a big risk, and it's on an undercard, and no one would see it. So... he's always been a tricky fighter, but a lot of what he used to be able to do was, it's like this concept of being a spoiler, but there are these fighters who, because they're a bit weird, they'll turn a 50-punch-around fighter into a 10-punch-around fighter. And that's what Assunção could do. That's part of why his fights were so boring. Very little happened a lot of the time. Guys were sort of like hypnotized into inactivity against him. And if he can do that to Henry, he's making him fight completely against type. That would be like the most impressive hypnotizing someone in the ring I've ever seen. The reason I'm suspecting Henry batters him is because Henry, that's what he does. He just works at 100 miles an hour. If he made the mistake of not fighting at his usual pace here, I can imagine he'll get chewed out in the corner between round 1 and round 2, and he'll come out and do better in the next round. There's the danger of being counterpunched, but Assunção, not a big hitter, but a big enough hitter to make people not throw against him, which is, part of the secret of why he was so successful while appearing to do so little. But Henry doesn't seem to care about being hit either. So, yeah, it's... I will be super impressed if Rafael Assunção wins, and I'll give him his respect and credit, of course. And, I like to give Assunção credit whenever I can. But I think at this stage in his career, with a guy who's kind of tailor-made to not fall into his usual strats, hard ask for him. I still haven't gone back and watched all Victor Henry's fights. I need to do that at some point. Because the Barcelos fight was one of the best fights of the year so far. Was that this year? That was this year, yeah. And we're in October, so saying so far is kind of pointless. I can't imagine it falls out of like my top 10 before the end of the year. I don't have a top 10 in my head. Don't come at me with like 9 fights you think are better and be like, oh, and there's not going to be one more happen that's better before then. Dusko Todorovic is fighting Jordan Wright. That's quite cool because you've got a couple of bouncy, karate, boxy sort of people there. Todorovic really blew it against Chidi Njokuani. I thought he had the tools to really give Njokuani a hard time. But it's kind of like, it's that thing that's, in mixed martial arts, you want to go to what you're better at, or you reckon you're better at. So he kind of just gave the straight wrestling, whereas I would want to see him mixing the striking. And RoboCop did. Fucking giving credit to RoboCop. People are like, why doesn't Jack like RoboCop? And I say he's a meme fighter, but I thought he did a great job. I mean, yeah, he had to tough his way through it, but it was a mix of the striking and the grappling, and he just put it all together. Because you're in a mixed martial arts bout, it's not a... Chidi Njokuani has not got this far by not wrestling, or not being able to deal with wrestling. You have to put it all together, and then hope that he trips up in either the area where he's already confident, or the area where he's not as confident because you're putting so much pressure on him. You got Serkinov versus Menifield, which should be a tee-up for Menifield. I mean, Serkinov has fallen off hard in the last few years. Tapology's got him ranked at number 75 and Menifield at number 29. Bloody hell. Nick Maximov's back and people are going to get well mad if he wins. But he's kind of fun just for watching a guy... I mean, part of the joy of fighting is that or MMA especially, is that there's no right way to do everything. And Nick Maximov's going to come out, grab a head outside single and slowly drag a guy to the floor. And that's as valid a way of beating this dude as if someone came out and sparked him in one punch. And that's quite fun. Making weird styles work is half the fun. Joe Anderson Brito versus Lucas Alexander. I don't know anything about Alexander, but I was watching Joe Anderson Brito's fights. He was short notice replacement for Algio in his first UFC fight. And gave a good account for himself, because in the first round he went after Algio hard, took him down, got on his back, threatened the choke, and then Algio did what Algio do. He went, actually, I think you're getting tired. And he turned back into him on the, into his closed guard. And I thought that was going to be the beginning of the end. But Brito actually barely looked different through the 3 rounds. It's just that Algeo did a lot of good work in walking him onto knees and uppercuts and things on the standing portion and then defending the takedowns fairly well. He was more effective in the first round, but I don't think he's like if you get him into the second round, he's going to instantly fall apart sort of fighter. And then obviously he shocked Andre Fili in his next one. Joe Anderson Brito, this is. Split his jab a couple of times because Fili loves his jab, wanted to get established, got distracted by being counter-jabbed, the dipping jab, the Juliana Pena masterpiece. And then he got clipped with the right hand over the top because he was getting wide, trying to score one back. I think he ate 3 good counter jabs to the face and then immediately started swinging and Brito hit him with the right hand over the top. It'll happen. I'm a big Fili fan, but it was he walked right into that. But then Fili completed the round robin by beating Bill Algeo. So it's like Chuck Vandy and Rampage, but not quite as exciting. Anything else good on here? Mike Jackson's on here. Fucking hell. It's quite funny that they have to keep offering him fights, that they gave him a traditional contract for the CM Punk fight. Because, the maximum amount of time that they're allowed between offering him fights is what they seem to do. And then he takes it and comes in. And last one, he fought that, was he the Irish lad who back kicked him in the dick? That was very funny. So, it could be funny. And CJ Vergara versus Tatsuro Taira, another good one in the flyweight division. I think that could be fun too. Jesus, how have I talked for 40 minutes about this card of all things? But like I said, it's not that bad. I'm quite enjoying looking at it. What did we lose off it? Cannonier versus Strickland. Don't care about that. And Magny versus Rodriguez. That could have been fun, but no biggie. Right. If you've not read the ADCC piece, sign up to Patreon. Go read it. If you are a patron, go and read it. There's going to be a test. And if you want to get in on the extra podcasts, extra articles, all that shit, support the podcast, become a Patreon boy. If you want to send an email to the podcast, jackslackpodcast@gmail.com. And if you want to see what I'm writing anytime, fightprimer.com. I am your boy, Jack Slack. Finding out that Vivian Araujo's name isn't Araujo, and that's ruined a lot of my jokes. Bless.